One thing that I was always raised with, and I think most of the people in the room as well, is you always pay your respects to country. And what that means is the native inhabitants who initially had the land that we're currently standing on. And in this case, it's the Chepenafa Indians. Grand Ron should be very familiar with that band. But for the rest of you who are unaware of this, because Ed, when I was here, I was unaware of this neat little factoid. So I want to share a little bit of the history of the Chepenafas so everyone has a better understanding. The ground that Oregon State University is currently on, the Marys River Indians. Chepenafas were formerly known as the Marys River Indians because their location at the forks of the St. Mary's Creek near present-day Corvallis, Oregon. They spoke the Marys River dialect of the Central Cayupuyan language. Some ethnologists have classified them as a subdivision of the Lukmute Indians, also another Cayupuyan-speaking people. Like other residents of the Willamette watershed, the Chepenafas lived in harmony with their environment before coming of settlers. Their male youth sought spirit powers by fasting 5 days and nights and swimming in a lake for routine travel. The Chepenafas propelled dugout canoes with long poles, decorated wooden paddles. Wood, which is abundant in their country, also figured in the ceremonials. For example, they suspended moss and hide-covered drumsticks and boards from their lodge roofs, which they beat with fire-hardened clubs to produce humming sounds. Disease such as smallpox and intermittent fever of the 1830s pretty much wiped out the Chepenafas, and they were unable to prevent non-Indian incursion. The few Chepenafas who remained were included in the January 4th, 1855 treaty with the United States, ratified March 3rd, 1855, which provided for their removal to a reservation. While other Cayupuyan speakers with them, they ceded their lands in the Willamette Valley to the now present-day Grand Ron Reservation in 1856. In 1870, Chepenafas numbered 49 on the reservation, and in 1910, only 24 remained. Part of that, as I mentioned, was the history of the land that we stand on. Once again, we pay respect to country. All of us should do that as we move around former Indian country and current present-day reservations as an example. But one thing I wanted to bring up, with the signing of those treaties, General Joel Palmer, some of you knowing him as the Oregon Indian Agent, helped orchestrate and negotiate 9 treaties from 1853 to his termination as he was removed by the present-day governor in 1857. For 4 years, for those 4 years, he negotiated, as I mentioned, 9 treaties. One of the treaties, the Middlebands, Columbia Basin, was the Warm Springs tribe, which I'm from, but also the Grand Ron, as I just mentioned. But now what I'd like to introduce you to is the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of General Joel Palmer, my daughter, Madison Shaw, to introduce me and give you a little bit more background. I had to take her out of school from Idaho to come here, so this is part of her extra credit work. Come on up, Madison Shaw. 6th generation removed from General Joel Palmer. Yeah, you go right ahead.
My dad is Bodie Shaw, and he asked me to introduce him to you today. My dad is from Warm Springs, Oregon, and is the Deputy Director for Fire Management for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA. Right now, he's in Boise, Idaho, at the National Interagency Fire Center. As Deputy Director, he is responsible for lots of things about wildland fire on Indian lands across the United States. My dad has talked in front of United States Congress regarding tribal land management issues. He has also talked a lot around the United States on tribal and natural resource use. Previously, Dad worked in Washington, D.C., in a lot of jobs that are too long to list. He worked for a congressman on Capitol Hill as well as the BIA. He has been a tribal forest manager and assistant professor at Oregon State University, too. In 2008, he was picked to go to Australia for 7 months, and he took us with him. So from August 2008 to March 2009, we all lived in Bendigo, Victoria. We went to school at Ecological Primary and played while Dad traveled around Australia and New Zealand, developing a new bushfire agreement between all of the countries. Dad was in the United States Air Force and is a Warm Springs tribal member. Dad has a master's, bachelor's, and associate's degree. He currently lives in Kuna, Idaho with my mom, Heather, and my brothers, Brendan and Cameron. But Dad has just taken a new job in Portland, Oregon, so now we have to move. Here's my dad, Bodie Shaw.
Well, it is important as we pay respect to country. That's something I learned. As Madison mentioned, we spent 7 months in Australia. I was sent over there specifically to develop should I move away from this? Specifically to develop a trilateral agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. specifically for fire management. So that ran the gamut of fire ecology, fire suppression, and it's a program that continues to reap benefits as we solidified agreements with the U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as the Department of Interior, and now tribes are signatory to these agreements. So I think that is an important piece. Well, thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it. Maybe. Okay. Thank you very much. So for the next half an hour or so, I want to walk you through a couple pieces that I believe are important, especially to this conference, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. I want to paint a couple different pictures for you. One, past Northwest history, fire use, and I want to compare and contrast that with some of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters in Australia that I got to spend a bit of time with. I was fortunate to be able to accept Val's invite this week in South Africa, Sun City, South Africa. I was presenting a similar discussion, globalization of fire management, comparing, contrasting United States and Australia. So, luckily, in some facets, Maddie's tired of traveling around with me, I think, but as everyone knows, the U.S. federal budget has been challenged quite a bit. Well, we finally had to shut that down when the government about shut down. Those of you remember about 6 weeks ago. So no international travel. I was fine with that, but I do want to share with you through the next few slides some of the same information that I would have presented in Sun City. So Val, thanks for the invite. I sure appreciate it. You guys have done great work putting this on. And some of the questions we heard on the previous presentation, I'm going to touch on. A lot of it is what some of the nomenclature that's changed over fire management, mega fires. A presentation I had given to the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, which President Bush had appointed 2002 and is currently in existence. The Wildland Fire Leadership Council is the highest ranking federal fire authority for wildland fire. We were able to convince them to come to Indian country, so in 2007 we visited Warm Springs and we held meetings specifically around federal fire policy, but shading it a little bit with indigenous fire use from a Northwest perspective. So I want to share some of that information as well. Also, before we get into the Australia piece, I want to share a little bit about trailing and tracking U.S. federal fire policy, how that's impacted Indian country, what are opportunities for TEK to be incorporated into federal fire policy. There's two initiatives I want to bring to your attention that currently are espousing some of the concepts dealing with TEK. As I mentioned, I will walk you through from an Indigenous Aboriginal standpoint. I got to do a lot of burning in the Northern Territories with the Niue people while I was in North Australia, and it is fascinating to hear about the items that are challenges to them, same challenges that we have, but from a policy standpoint, it's a lot different in terms of federal recognition. Here in the U.S., we have 565 federally recognized tribes. In Australia, they do not have a quote-unquote parliamentarian or federal recognition process for the Aboriginal tribes around Australia. But there's still some positives to that. I'll also talk a little bit about the carbon sequestration program that Aboriginal groups are leading in Australia and are a global example of the benefits of using fire on the landscape and what are some of the potential ecological benefits. Climate change, we heard some of the discussion this morning. After living in Australia, some of the most acute pieces of climate change are felt on that continent, probably more so than anywhere else in the world. So they're, I hate to say it, but light years ahead of where the U.S. is in terms of understanding the impacts on their environment and what they need to do as a country to start affecting change. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then I'll add at the end my piece on what the future holds from my perspective. My perspective, once again, being the Deputy Fire Director dealing specifically with Indian country fire management issues and how those policy changes have at times benefited here of recent years, but also impacted Indian country when it comes to fire use as a tool. One of the things I wanted to share, since I have been able to visit a few countries under the auspices of fire management, I wanted to share at least some of my information that I've gleaned from Aboriginal and here within the U.S. Fire use and what traditional use of fire means to different indigenous groups. So I'm talking New Zealand, the Maoris, Northern Territories, the Victorian Aboriginal groups, as well as Northwest, Southwestern U.S., Northeastern fire use tribes. And I want to share at least a little bit some of the responses, because some of it may surprise you, but I think also for some of you it might not be all that surprising. I was glad to hear Danielle mention we heard bracken fern earlier, but the beargrass, Xerophyllum tenax. Ed's painfully aware, my master's work here, as I dragged him through the ringer at times, dealt specifically with fire application for cultural food production, in this case the vaccinium species, huckleberries. And I just wanted to point this out, one of the interesting pieces of our research found that huckleberry growth and fruiting production after 7 years after introduction of fire really dependent on pollination. We heard from Charles this morning the humblebee-bumblebee story. We found a direct correlation to fruiting capability of beargrass timed with huckleberry fruit production and the ability of pollinators to do their business, as Charles was talking about in his poetry piece this morning. And it's something that we had heard from, at least from my side, the Wasco side of the family, that the bees had a role to play. Now, so that research we finished in 1995. 1994, when we were collecting data, one of the heaviest rain periods in the Northwest. Well, when you got that much rain, pollinators aren't flying. And we noticed a down year when we went to collect after the Huckleberry Feast. So, and it's that traditional environmental knowledge that really played a key role in some of the outcomes, as well as when beargrass was flowering was the time to be harvesting huckleberries. So you don't read about those in books, but you hear about it passed down from generation to generation. And that was a key piece. So it was interesting. I really enjoyed hearing your research work, Danielle. That was very informational. And so these were some of the responses. The Niu people in Northern Territories, if you're familiar with Australia, the Darwin, very northernmost tip of Australia. The Niue people live about 50 kilometers to the southwest of Darwin on the Daly River. So as we went around and we continued to burn, they were burning to a great extent because of cane toads. Have any of you heard of cane toads? And so you're very familiar with the detrimental impacts that they have had on the continent of Australia when introduced in Queensland. As they moved to the west, towards Western Australia, they have consumed, and I thought about throwing some pictures in. They've taken out some of the most venomous snakes that Australia has. As you can imagine, you get a snake that wants to take out a toad. It seems like easy pickings. Well, the cane toads are not that at all. They have really wreaked havoc on the ecosystems because there's no way to control them. But they found that fire as a tool can do a very good job. So when we were burning, this would have been November of 2008, they were specifically doing it for feral eradication. Wild boars, water buffalo, and cane toads. So we see the different uses of tools, different uses of fire as a tool to promote overall bush, forest, and rangeland health. Not a big surprise to many in the room, but Australia provides some unique differences, but also some similarities as well. The final piece on this note, we all understand the importance of exercising and utilizing fire on the landscape, whether it be from pre-European settlement, currently, and for the future. But most of it, here in the U.S., we call it exercising our treaty rights. The same thing in Australia, recapturing country and culture. They don't have a quote-unquote treaty as an example, but what they do have is recapturing country. And they've used that tool. Aboriginal fire use goes back 40,000 years. We heard this morning, and that's what here in the U.S. or former Indian country, about 10,000 years. Well, Aboriginal fire use goes back to 40,000 years when, those of you familiar with geography of Australia, Tasmania was connected to the mainland. So 40,000 years, they have a fire history that has been handed down from generation to generation. Many people, the Niue people as one example, still continue to live off the land with no federal, state support. So what that means, and I got to spend some time with them, still living out in the bush huts, and they really have eschewed any sort of federal involvement. They grew up that way, they want to stay that way, and that involvement spoke volumes in terms of how they've recaptured country, whether it be ecological processes or recaptured country from a political standpoint. Aboriginal issues in Australia continue to stay at the forefront. Some of you may remember in 2008, the Prime Minister, President equivalent, formally issued a declaration of apology to the Indigenous folks of Australia. And we happened to be over there at the time. That really set a high bar in terms of future parliaments in reaching out to Aboriginal tribes around Australia to ensure their place at the table. Still have a long ways to go, but I thought that really spoke volumes. I wanted to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, fire history, and unfortunately, we might get some of these. Let me pull all these up. These are some of the mega fires, or what some may classify as catastrophic fires that have occurred in the last, within the last 100 years, but I had some older, these aren't going to come up as well as they should have. Going back roughly 150 years, taking a look at fire impacted landscapes. We had a question this morning about some of the suppression and how far that really goes back. Within Western Oregon, 50 some odd tribes, pre-European settlement, inhabited Western Oregon valleys. And as I mentioned, a lot of them were put into on the Grand Ronde Reservation as an example. We now have 9 reservations in Oregon. and it's been a mixed bag in terms of how tribes were assembled on those reservations. My tribe, as an example, 2 hunter-gatherer groups, the Wascos and the Warm Springs, and then a raiding band, the Paiutes, that were added 20 years after the treaty was signed. A lot, and I still, Frank must remember because he's laughing back there, my grandmother still tells me that you can't trust a Paiute. And the treaty was signed 130, almost 140 years ago, but it's still to that day, and I wanted to save that joke. The Jims were here, Paiute representatives from Warm Springs, but I got a chance to catch up with them today. But a lot of that still holds true today. But what I wanted to show you was over the last 150 years, some of the largest mega fires have occurred when we get into the era of post-European settlement and suppression. This slide was used at the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, as I mentioned, and what we wanted to share with them is that, and at least with this generation in the room here, you don't hear a lot about catastrophic fires in Western Oregon, but if you look at our fire history, this place was meant to burn, and it's going to burn whether or not, well, it's going to burn. And in fact, Debbie Ray, my mother-in-law here, her husband writes for the Corvallis Gazette-Times. He wrote a story 2 years ago, I think, right exactly on this fact that Western Oregon has had some of the most catastrophic fires in geologic history, stand replacement events. And it is important for communities to understand, we heard earlier this morning, wildland-urban interface, the place where the wildlands meet up with communities. Everyone's pretty familiar with Western Oregon, Willamette Valley, and just how sparsely populated those areas are now becoming. Populations that weren't there when a lot of the Indian tribes originally had inhabited that before pre-European history.
When did that fire occur east of Eugene?
That would have been 19, and I'm trying to think, and I apologize, it didn't, all my markers didn't come up. 1922, I want to say.
I drove back and forth to Bend quite a bit.
Oh, that fire's coming up.
That was 2003.
Yeah, there's a B&B complex in that area. I'll talk about some of those here in a second because the story continues. And there it is right there, B&B complex, those of you can see, 2003. So yeah, as you come across the Cascade Range, that's what the fire scars that you see in there. A lot of that very high intensity. Those of you remember in 2003 when that fire was actually happening, we had some of the biggest fires in 2002 in 3 states' history. Rodeo Chetaskai in Arizona off the White Mountain Apache Reservation, 500,000 acres. Biscuit Fire in 2002, Oregon's largest fire, 500,000 acres. Colorado, the Hayman Creek Fire, arson caused fire, but at that time was Colorado's largest fire in its history. So we're starting to see some of these others you may not be as familiar with. Virginia Lake Complex on the Colville Indian Reservation. Rex Creek Complex, I wanted to point out on that fire, one of the first in the lower 48 contiguous states that burned over winter. And what happened there, you had root-to-root contact, even though you may have had 2 to 3, 4 feet of snow, continued to burn through the winter, and as spring arrived, took off again. One of the first times in history. A lot of that dealing with the accumulation of forest fuels that continued to build due to suppression, due to the lack of fire use on the landscape, but there's more to that story as well. But I did want to point out, because we have, working at the National Fire Center, we have data coming at us from every possible angle. 2000 to 2008, years 2000, 2008, every year fire expenditures continued to escalate, whereas in 2008, we ended up spending just over $3 billion for fires. And you think about how much money that really is just to suppress. So the contrast, or at least the arguments that we've tried to make, if we can really put some of that money, and Indian country is leading the way, if you look at accomplishments for fire use and fuels work, if we can put that money back into a prescribed use or fire adapted culture, we're going to be better off in the end. And we've used research to help us show that. We've partnered with Utah State University, Washington State. I know Oregon State's dabbled a little bit, Paul Dosher, with some of sagebrush steppe work. So it's out there, but we need to really push that research a little further, especially with budgets, federal budgets, declining the way they are. We really need to be quite articulate and show research beyond a shadow of a doubt the benefits of fire in certain situations, not every situation. But Indian country is leading the way. I mentioned 565 federally recognized tribes. 244 of those tribes have fire management programs. So we have the depth, we have the breadth, and I can pick out a story from every geographic region around the U.S. that has a story to tell, that goes back generations to how fire has been utilized across the landscape. We, with Indian Affairs, have funded a number of cultural education programs that continue to espouse those virtues that CSKT, the Confederate Tribes, Salish Kootenai Tribes out of Montana, some of the firework that they've done. There's a number of success stories out there that we need to continue to share. Here's another, and I'm glad this question came up earlier. I want to run you through a series of slides that talk about some of the fire-adapted landscapes post-European establishment. I won't say a lot, I just want to run you through a few slides and then you take from it what you will. For those of you who can't read, the red burned areas and then the green forest landscapes. Willamette Valley, Cascades, the Blue Mountains, Umatilla. The last was 1900, this is 1914. So you see fire on the landscape starting to diminish, 1936. And remember the previous slide, I talked about the Yakult fires, Silverton, Tillamook fires, and you see that big piece of red up in the northwest. That's what you're seeing there. Another pictogram of kind of the same story, but a little closer in on the northwest Oregon coast down to about Newport. Recent burns in red, and you see that fire leaving as part of the landscape that we'd see. The first slide, I know it's hard in the back to see, 1850, 1890, 1920, 1940, with the exception of the Tillamook burns, not a lot of fire on the landscape in fire-adapted ecosystems that historically had burned naturally, and also a lot of Indian use of fire. So some of the reasons behind that, we're aware of the treaties that we had talked specifically about, but what were the policy measures that basically eradicated Indian fire use on the landscape? I think somebody may have mentioned Dawes Act from 1887. One of the posters that Ed, you may remember. I'm not sure. 1887.
I was the graphic artist for that poster.
But it tells a story. 148 million acres down to 48. 56 million acres of trust land we currently have. I was sharing with Ed yesterday. One of the president's initiatives, President Obama, he's met twice now with Indian nations back in D.C., has reinforced the trust responsibility, specifically in this case what we're calling land into trust. So bulk of Indian Affairs funding is going towards that program, land into trust. And what that means, tribes that have the financial capability to buy back fee or state, county, or private land, they can convert that to what's called trust. Trust is still held in by federal government, but the tribes ultimately have power over them. I'm going to talk about self-governance, Public Law 638 here in a little bit and what that really means. But what the Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, really did was gut Indian country from 150, and that's an approximate guess back at that time, to 50 million. 50 million here, we're at 6 million. We're attempting to convert 100,000 acres a year. This is the federal BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, conversion. Maddie mentioned we're moving to Portland. One of the programs I'll take over is Land into Trust, and that will be one of my priorities as coming from a Warm Springs tribe who have constantly tried to convert that land. Some tribes doing it for gaming interests, some doing it just to buy back some of their homeland. Couldn't be more important. So that will be one of the priorities, and that has been spoken by the president, which says a lot. One of the first times that we've had a president that really has spoken out for Indian country. So after the Dawes Allotment Act, we had the Merriam Report, which documented the failures of Indian policy by the federal government. Those that had not been working. That led to the IRA, Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. What this really allowed is tribes to start to look at their own form of governance. And this really turned, or helped tribes turn the corner in terms of moving their government, sovereign governments, to a healthy level. Unfortunately, we started to peak, and now we've taken another nosedive with the termination relocation area. Grand Ronde knows very well the impacts of that, given their termination. But then reestablishment 83. But many tribes still have not recovered, and by that I mean they lost their federal recognition with termination. Many have yet to get that back. Tribes petition quite often, as Madison mentioned. I worked in Washington, D.C. Part of it was dealing with federal recognition of Indian tribes. And that's a tough program to help administer, given that many of those tribes lost either through termination area, but there's many others, Wampanoags, back from present-day Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, that have had a long struggle to get recognized. There's many tribes on the eastern seaboard that still do not have federal recognition as of yet. Some have state recognition, but until you're federally recognized, you just don't have the tools at your disposal that a recognized tribe would. Dissolving a tribal land, I'll use Klamath out of Oregon. Each tribal member who so wished gave up the land, got a couple $1,000s, but you lost your recognition, which is a very sad story in itself, because it's not just Klamath. There were hundreds of tribes that actually were impacted by this and still continue to try to get that back. And that has been a very tough road for sure. I talked earlier, Office of Self-Governance, Self-Determination, tribes with Nixon now have said we need to give back what we've taken in terms of sovereignty. Wish we had a land base to work off, but this was the beginning. Just want to share some of the policy pieces of this, because this is critically important. I mentioned Public Law 638. We have self-governance tribes within Indian Affairs. Roughly half of the 565 have gone either self-governance, or where they've compacted the entire federal program, whether it be forestry, fire, police, public health and safety. They've compacted. Those are 211 tribes have compacted their programs, telling the federal government, thank you, we can do this job, so we give them tribal shares, and they run those programs. 638 are contract tribes, and that means, I'll use my tribe as an example, Warm Springs, have contracted the forestry and fire program. They still have a federal presence. The trustee would be a superintendent, as an example, but we give, Warm Springs case, their tribal shares or money to run a forestry and fire program. Grand Ronde, similar? Yeah. And that's important. Coming from that tribe where we were federal and now we've gone just tribal, it is a sense of pride to do it yourself, bringing up tribal members, and that also has worked very well. I spoke last week in Palm Springs at the Self-Governance Conference about fire management, and many tribes, as I mentioned, 240 some, are fire tribes that we give money to, either through compact, contract, or direct service. But that's half of federally recognized tribes. More and more have expressed an interest in a fire management program, as an example, and that's important as their fire culture tends to become more important and get back what they've lost, and we couldn't be happier, especially me. Once again, just reiterating the power of Indian self-determination by compacting or contracting those programs, giving it back to the tribes. I'm going to shift gears on you now. We're going to jump across Pacific, about 14,000 kilometers, right, Madison? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I wanted to share a quote. Did anyone in the room know Joe Dela Cruz? I figured Mike did. There's good. One of the great visionary leaders in Indian country, especially when it came to self-determination and the power that tribes have and need to exercise by tribal self-governance. A great quote I just wanted to leave you with. Now, Maddie, let's go across the pond. Madison mentioned we were over there. I was working on the trilateral agreement, which we have approved by the State Department, which now allows transfer of resources, whether it be aviation, whether it be human resources, firefighting personnel, as well as Aboriginal groups, to start to work with a lot of our indigenous communities here on technical aspects as well as educational aspects and culture. Huge agreement that very proud of. One of the items that we had to address there, I don't know if many of you remember in 2009, Australia experienced one of their worst fires in history. How many remember that? I want to walk you through that because we were living there. The town we lived in lost 63 homes. Altogether, 2,000 homes were lost in an afternoon. Madison was there with their brothers and sisters, a very chaotic time. What was the temperature, Maddie, you remember? Celsius. What was the temperature? 48.6 degrees, which runs to about 122, 23 degrees. On a Saturday afternoon, there was buildup. We had a lot of media coverage about the potential of one of the worst fire days in Australia. Unfortunately, it came to fruition. And what led to this was the hot Victorian desert winds that came from, those of you familiar with Australia. The central part of Australia, the Victorian desert, 0 to 3% humidity, winds that day upwards of 70 miles an hour. So you knew something bad was going to happen. You could feel it. Debbie's been over there. It's a different type of heat. Even on an afternoon day, you may hit 90 degrees. It's a different type of biting heat. It's really much different than what we would expect here. So on a day when you're approaching 120 degrees, over 100 by 9 o'clock in the morning, you felt it. This was a community called King Lake. The town was completely overrun by fire. 300-foot mountain ashes pulled from the ground in firestorms. I'll walk you through some of these. I worked not only for the Department of Sustainability and Environment, which is a Victoria state government, as a firefighter during my off times not traveling, but you see this little red truck, the Country Fire Authority, which had protection on Aboriginal and private land holdings. This day, 1.1 million acres burned in an afternoon. This is on the outskirts of Melbourne, a population of 3.5 million people. Fire-adapted communities, very much so, but no one was prepared for a day like I'll walk you through here. And the importance of this, and I'll just preface my words real quickly, is some of the fallout of this and the Aboriginal use of fire. We'll talk about that, but let me walk you through some of these. Unless you want to, Madison, you were there, and it was a very traumatic time. We had folks from the U.S. wondering how we had fared. They knew the town that we lived in had been burned across, not over, like so many other communities. Just outside of King Lake. King Lake was about 55 miles from where we lived, a town that lost 43 lives in that afternoon. Completely caught off guard by that fire event. Once again, we have the same story here. Fire suppression happened also this is Southeast Australia, Victoria. Fire suppression also has led and played a role in this fire, and that came out in the royal inquiries. One of our CFA units, once again, I mentioned this is the private, not the state, firefighting organization. We were lucky that we didn't lose any firefighters' lives, and people ask me, why do you think we didn't lose any lives that day? The only reason is that the winds were so hard that day, blowing so hard and so fast with such ferocity, there was no way you were going to get in front of that thing. There was no way you were going to catch that. Airplanes couldn't fly on it, so we backed away and tried to deal with any mitigation. Flank and attack was what did we have? 411 fire starts that day that ultimately grew to the 1.1 million acres, but this is what you saw coming in on an engine, column after column. This is out in the rangelands just north of Melbourne. Outside of King Lake, this was the next morning. The previous evening, private farmers in their tanks. Now this is looking from Melbourne, one of the skyscrapers. This is a power plant about 15 miles in the distance. People knew at this time that lives were lost because communications were cut off. And I remember hearing it's such a helpless feeling about what you can do. A lot of the lives that were lost were due to confusion. One road in, one road out. So the wildland-urban interface is definitely an issue. It was an issue for them in terms of ingress, egress. This was King Lake. As you could imagine, you get those firefighters in the room, you get into a smoke screen, it's hard enough to get your own self individually out, let alone if you're trying to get out in a car and you run into someone, have no idea which way the fire's coming, because this was 360 degrees fire starts, 14 kilometers spotting, 6-7 miles spotting in front of itself. Wind shift, since we're on the coast at 1800, 6 o'clock. So now the winds are driving. What didn't burn is now being burned. More of the photos. Just tragic loss of life due to wildfire, and a lot tied to the historical application of fire suppression. This is a photo I took, and this is exactly what you had to face. Brake lights on, where do we go? What are we doing? You see the column, how it's bent over, so you know it's moving towards you now, for those of you not familiar with the fire piece. So, flank attacks were not going to work, and the agreement was we're going to back off until the sun goes down. Because mind you, it's 120 degrees plus on a day like this, and there's not a lot you can do. This is something that man is not going to be able to handle. Madison mentioned we lived in a town called Bendigo. These are photos taken from one of our air attack helicopters in the town of Bendigo. Just an amazing. And this is fire around Victoria, but I'll show you a map here in a second. It's really a very small area, 1.1 million acres. And well, as Maddie remembers, there was smoke everywhere, mass confusion, not knowing which way to go, where to go. I wasn't with them, so my wife Heather, it was very tough. Luckily, the CFA brigade, the fire trucks I was telling you about, the captain who I worked with was making sure that he was in contact with Heather, knowing that Americans in Australia living way out in the bush probably doesn't have a lot of, doesn't provide a lot of safety when you're in a foreign country and one of the hottest days ever on record, and you got fires everywhere. More sheds. We lived in a similar house like this. This isn't far from where we were staying, but seeing a black wall like that, it's a very difficult, very difficult thing to face. And I wish we could have got a taller lens, because you can see the fire, some of the gaseous, flammable flame that's still hundreds of feet up above the forest floor. Absolutely amazing. This is what I mentioned, Melbourne, just down here, 3.5 million people, and just on the outskirts, mountain ash forests, some of the most pristine eucalypt forests in the world, 300 feet tall, gone in a matter of hours. The watershed, the water that Melbourne drinks, many the watersheds were impacted by that fire. One of the first groups that I called from the U.S. for dispatch was the burned area emergency response teams. They're bear teams. I don't know if any of you have heard of them. I dispatched 3 of them to come over, and their priority was to rehabilitate as quickly as possible the watersheds and catchments that Melbourneites so sorely depended on. We brought over 13 Indian Affairs employees, and we were able to partner a lot of them with the Aboriginal groups and tribes around Victoria. And the reason that that's important, I mentioned, and as you can imagine, with 173 deaths, 2,029 homes, 7,500 people displaced, 1.1 million acres burned, someone's going to pay for this. And what happened, the parliamentarian inquiry, which would be like a presidential inquiry on our part, immediately came down, wanted to know who was to blame, how do we prevent this, and who's going to answer to the people. Well, the Aboriginal groups from Victoria played a key role in that inquiry, because it finally got around to the discussion, well, what was the historic fire use patterns of the mountain ash in that part of Australia? And if we, this was the memorial a week after the fire, and once it finally got down to the issuance of that report, and that report was to dictate how the state of Victoria would not allow these fires to happen again, a specific portion of that dealt with historic fire use, Aboriginal fire use within southeastern Victoria. And now the Aboriginal people, as you remembered previously, I mentioned with the public apology, they have an Aboriginal ambassador who works directly for the Prime Minister. Now they've raised fire to a level that at least needs to be listened to and hopefully enacted on. And as I've talked to some of my Aboriginal mates as well as state fire folks, it seems to be working. They had a very cool and wet summer this year, so it gave them tremendous opportunity to throw fire back on the landscape. This year they accomplished nearly 400,000 hectares of burnable bush, an all-time high for Victoria. But that's what the government wants to keep them doing. But the Aboriginal connection is key, because they've had a hand in exactly what we are trying to do. One of my questions this morning to Eric was how we, the tribes, ensure that for federal documentations, whether it be land management plans, resource management plans that are authored by the federal trustee, tribes have a seat at the table for co-authoring. That's happening in Victoria, first time ever. Northern Territories are looking at that as a model as well. I mentioned briefly earlier some of the burning that is being done in the Northern Territories. I mentioned Darwin, East Arnhem Land. This was some of the burning that we were able to conduct with the traditional landowners, as they're called. They're the Niu people. One thing I will mention that I think we better wrap up is if you look historically at Northern Australia, 70% of that country historically burned. 70% of that country still burns, but it's the timing of those burns that have wreaked a lot of havoc. The indigenous landowners, traditional landowners, burned at key cool times, low intensity, those times of the years where now fires are occurring on a catastrophic mega fire level, burning at the most inopportune times around Northern Australia. Well, they'll burn millions of hectares every year. Very sparsely populated, but a lot of the traditional foods that the Aboriginal tribes rely on are now being very difficult to find. A lot of it is the fire use pattern post-European settlement. If you get a chance, Northern Australia has a research university that has partnered with the Arnhem Land traditional owners, looking at how fire use on the landscape has benefited them, as well as the carbon sequestration program. A good model for all of us to take a look at, because they are, especially when it comes to climate change, light years ahead of where we are, but they're also feeling it quite acutely. So what does our future hold? I mentioned a couple policy items. Have any of you heard of the cohesive strategy? It's a new fire policy based out of the FLAME Act, Federal Land Assistant Management. I'm gonna butcher it, but it's called the FLAME Act. And that pot of money that Congress has appropriated sets aside a pool of money this year, about $72 million, for specific use on fire-adapted ecosystems. So basically, what cohesive strategy does is try to take a national approach to fire policy that incorporates local, state, tribal, and federal government entities. Everyone has a seat at the table. I've been in these meetings. It is important. It's a big elephant to take a bite out of right now, but I wrote this piece, Why Does Indian Country Need to Be Involved? I wrote that and sent that around to tribes just to give a little more context to why this issue was important to tribes, exercising treaty rights from a sovereign perspective, but Indian country needs to stay engaged with federal fire policy, because it does have a tremendous impact, albeit mostly from a budgetary standpoint. But self-governance tribes can do their own thing. They've done a great job, but the funding stream is critically important. So just a note, keep an eye on cohesive strategy. The president has pushed for it. The federal fire leadership, as well as tribal leadership and some of our key fire tribes, has also been involved. And I wrote a quick piece on TEK. If you read the policy, there's specific mention to ecological knowledge within there, trying to learn and partner that with Western science. This is a key piece. As many, if not all in this room, are very aware, considered anecdotal previously, but now it's starting to gain and get its rightful place in the sun, so to speak.